أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. Praise Him. We seek His aid and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu sallallahu alayhi wasallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone, no partnership, and never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, friends and family, brothers and sisters, everybody tuning in to the live stream, and everybody joining us for the Zoom room. Thank you for joining us again for our Sunday discussion of When the Moon Split, a biography about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu compiled by Safiur, Rahman, Mubarakpuri. So where we left off last week was at the bottom of, the top here of the difficulties in Medina, page 138, inshallah. And we should be continuing until either the start of, or at least some of the details regarding the Battle of Badr, inshallah. So last week we had jumped into and talking about the migration, about the hijrah of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. And now we're getting into the establishment of that community and the things that have happened or the history that happened at that point. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. So difficulties in Medina. So although the immigrants rejoiced over their freedoms from the pagans, life in Medina presented several difficulties. They had left their homes and belongings and now had to start all over again. Most of them had been traders, while the main occupation in Medina was date cultivation. And furthermore, the climate did not suit the newcomers, many of whom were soon stricken with fever. The Prophet ﷺ was aware of the great sense of displacement among the muhajirin, the immigrants, and made the following prayer. Bismillah, O Allah, make Medina as dear to us as Mecca was, or even dearer. Make its climate salubrious. Not quite sure of that word. New word for me, alhamdulillah. And bless its fruit and grains. So Allah granted the Prophet ﷺ's prayer, and the immigrants regained their health and began to love Medina. And as they became engaged in establishing social and emotional ties in Medina, they found the city becoming more and more of a home to them. So the Prophet's mosque, so soon after arriving in Medina, the Prophet ﷺ began the process of setting up the first Muslim state. And first, he launched the construction of a mosque. He brought the land where his she-camel had knelt down, about 100 cubits in length and breadth. And there were a few graves located on the land which had to be moved, as well as some date trees that had to be replanted. So the mosque walls were made of earth and unbaked bricks. Its roof was made from branches of date trees, and tree trunks served as columns. Sand and pebbles were spread across the floor. And the mosque had 3 doors, and the Qibla, a niche in the wall, where the leaders of the prayer stands, was made to face in the direction of Beit al-Maqdis, Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, Al-Quds. And the Prophet ﷺ worked along with the Muhajirin, the Meccan immigrants, and the Ansar, the Muslims of Medina, or the helpers, building the mosque. And while they carried away the bricks, the rocks, and the tree trunks, they chanted work songs to make their toil easier. And 2 apartments were also built near the mosque for the Prophet ﷺ's 2 wives, Sauda bint Zama and Aisha bint Abu Bakr, whom the Prophet ﷺ married soon after he arrived in Medina. And these apartments were built of stone, of mud, and date palms. So regarding the call to prayer, at last the Muslims had a house of worship all of their own. They no longer had to congregate surreptitiously, as they had in Mecca at Beit al-Arqam. In Medina, they began to perform all 5 prayers in congregation in the Prophet's mosque, and the only problem was that the people were unsure of when each prayer would begin. And the Prophet ﷺ asked his followers for suggestions of how to solve this problem, and some suggested that a shell or a conch should be blown. Omar, ever direct, proposed that someone should be appointed to call it out loudly. Prayer is about to begin, and the Prophet ﷺ liked Omar's idea and put it into practice. Later, however, Abdullah bin Zayd bin Abdul Rabb al-Ansari had a dream in which he heard a beautiful prayer call. He related his dream to the Prophet ﷺ, who realized that this dream was meant to be fulfilled, and he asked Abdullah to teach the words to Bilal bin Rabah, who had a strong and beautiful voice. And Bilal learned the words and called out to the Muslims of Medina, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allah is most great, Allah is most great. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah, which is the adhan. I testify there's no deity except Allah. I testify there's no deity except Allah. I testify Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. I testify that Muhammad is the prophet of Allah. Come to prayer, come to prayer, come to success, come to success. Allah is the most great. Allah is the most great, and there's no deity except Allah. And then when Omar heard the new prayer call, he hurried to the mosque and said, by Allah, I have heard this call in my dreams. And from the day onward, the Muslims gathered at the mosque whenever they heard Bilal make the prayer call. So the brotherhood between the Muhajirin and the Ansar. So the Ansar tried to outdo each other in making the Muhajirin comfortable in Medina and put themselves and their possessions at the service of the newcomers. Their generosity is mentioned in the following verse of the Quran, Surah 59, Ayat 9, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the English translation, the Ansar loved the Muhajirin who sought refuge with them, and there is no jealousy in their hearts for what the Muhajirin have been given. The Ansar give the Muhajirin preference over themselves, although they were in need of what the Muhajirin received. And the Prophet ﷺ helped create a strong bond between the 45 immigrants and their host by assigning each immigrant to a particular family in Medina. So each immigrant, therefore, was declared a member of the family that he was assigned to. And they were to share each other's grief and suffering, and they were even allowed to inherit from each other. And later, however, the permission to inherit from each other was abrogated by the verse in the Quran, limiting inheritance to bloodkin. And the brotherhood that was born between the Ansar and the Muhajirin was no superficial bond based on sufferance of the Prophet ﷺ's instruction, but a deep sense of kinship that is difficult to imagine today. The Ansar felt such a great responsibility for their Meccan prophets that once they even went to the Prophet ﷺ and offered to give half of their precious date groves to the Muhajirin. And when the Prophet ﷺ would not allow them to do so, they made a second suggestion. The Muhajirin can do some work in the groves and receive a share from the Prophets as compensation, and the Prophet ﷺ accepted this proposal. So Sa'ad bin Rabi'ah was a wealthy Ansari, a singular form of the Ansar. He was paired with an immigrant, Abdul Rahman bin Auf, and Saud not only offered Abdul Rahman half his possessions, but also offered one of his wives. I have two wives, he said. Tell me which one is more pleasing to you. I shall divorce her so that you may marry her. So Abdul Rahman did not take advantage of his host's generosity. May Allah bless your family and your possessions. Just tell me where the market is. And like most Meccans, he was a skilled merchant, and soon he was able to support himself with his earnings from the market. And shortly thereafter, he married a woman from the Ansar. So the Islamic community, this brotherhood between individual immigrants and their host families, created a strong sense of community that was further consolidated when the Prophet ﷺ instituted common rules of conduct for all. However, Medina was also home to two other communities, the polytheists who had not accepted Islam and the Jewish tribes. As we recall from previously beforehand, the Jews were awaiting for a messenger or a prophet to come. They used to threaten that to those pagan Arabs, that they will extract their revenge at the moment when he will come. So they were occupying this land in anticipation for him. So in order to avoid the kind of conflicts that the Muslims had experienced in Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ entered into a covenant with these two communities. And the following points were included in that document. So the Ansar and any other tribes who signed a treaty with them were a distinct Ummah nation. So first and foremost, that the payment of blood money and the release of prisoners between them and the Muslims would take place according to past practice, and the two non-Muslim communities of Medina would help the Muslims in matters of ransom and blood money. Second, all three communities of Medina would unite against any criminals rebels, or hostile armies, even if they should be their own offspring. Third, no Muslim was allowed to kill another Muslim to aid a non-Muslim, nor could he help a non-Muslim against a Muslim. Four, the obligations owed to Allah were common to all Muslims, and the entire community was responsible for the discharge of this duty if an individual failed to carry out his responsibility. Fifth, Jews who became Muslim would be treated as any other Muslim. Six, booty would be shared by all Muslims. Seven, one who deliberately killed a Muslim would be killed unless the victim's family forgave the killer. It was incumbent upon Muslims to rise against the killer. Eight, it was unlawful for a Muslim to support anyone who tried to create dissension among Muslims or anyone who attempted to tamper with the tenets of Islam. Nine, Allah and his Prophet ﷺ would settle all disputes arising among any of the three communities. And the covenant marked a turning point for Muslims, for they were bound to each other by a solemn undertaking, and through the course of later events, they would prove that this unity, the brotherhood, and cooperation sown by the covenant had flowered and borne fruit. And as for the position of the Muslims, vis-a-vis the non-Muslims, the covenant signified that the Muslims were strong enough to set their own terms. And it was made apparent to the polytheists that they would not be able to challenge the Muslims' authority. And most of the chieftains and notables of Medina had become Muslim, and there was no one capable of leading those opposed to Islam into open rebellion. So realizing this, the Prophet ﷺ wanted to ensure that the non-Muslims who were discontent with the new power structure did not look to Mecca for help, and he made the non-Muslims agree to the following stipulations. We will not shelter the Quraysh, nor will we refuse to offer protection to the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ drew up a separate covenant between the Muslims and the Jews, which are as following. The first being the Jews and the Muslims would live together as two separate nations, each with their own way of life and each in charge of its own financial affairs. Interesting, that's the first thing. Second, both nations would jointly defend the city from attack, and each would defend its own people. Third, both nations would coexist peacefully, and neither was to meddle in the affairs of the other or in any way attempt to destabilize the other. Fourth, neither nation was responsible for the misdeeds of the other. Five, the oppressed would be helped and supported. Six, both nations would bear the expenses of war. Seven, subversion and unwarranted bloodshed were unlawful for both nations. And eight, all disputes would be referred to Allah and his Prophet, ﷺ. Interesting point that's there. And the Quraysh and their allies were not to be aided or given refuge. And 10, the covenant would not provide any safeguard to wrongdoers or criminals. And I say that regarding point number 8, that of course, if you don't believe that this person is a prophet, or first off, that is mentioned that this person is the one that you refer to or are taking guidance from, why would they write that in there to begin with? Alhamdulillah. An interesting reflection. But this covenant united the three communities of Medina and defined the Prophet ﷺ as the undisputed head of state. And once everyone understood his rights and responsibilities, the Prophet ﷺ began to actively call the other two communities to Islam. So many embraced Islam, and those who preferred their own religion lived in peace with the ruling Muslims. There were others, however, who were interested neither in Islam nor peaceful coexistence. And a faction of them became Muslims so as to weaken them from within. And they were later known as the hypocrites, and their leader was Abdullah bin Ubay. And together with the group of hostile non-Muslims, they represented the greatest threat to the security of Medina. Of course, having somebody from the inside to dismantle them is the worst of things. But the Quraysh test the Muslims' resolve. So in spite of all the precautions that the Prophet ﷺ took to ensure that Medina remained safe and peaceful, the Quraysh were determined to destabilize the city. The Quraysh sent word to the polytheists of Medina, ordering them to help drive out the Muslims. And if the polytheists refused to help, the Quraysh threatened to kill their children and capture their women. And the Prophet ﷺ found out about the threats and convinced the polytheists not to give in to the strong-armed tactics employed by the Quraysh. So the Quraysh see that the turn of events and their frustration was apparent when Sa'd bin Mu'adda went to Mecca to perform Umrah, the minor pilgrimage, as he circumambulated the Kaaba with Abu Sufyan Umayyah bin Khalaf. He met Abu Jahl, and Abu Jahl recognized him as one of the residents of Medina who had become Muslim and accosted Sa'd. So you find safety in Mecca while you've been provided refuge to the faithless. By God, if you were not with Abu Sufyan, you would not return home safe and sound. And Abu Jahl's threat indicated that the Quraysh were intent on keeping Muslims from visiting the Kaaba and performing their religious duties there. And it also indicated that they were prepared to kill unarmed Muslims. And the Jews of Medina also represented another threat to the Muslims. They played on the old rivalry because the two tribes of Medina, the Aus and Khawarij, hoping to rekindle the bitter feud that had once rent them, the fledgling Muslim community faced threats from both within and without. And the danger of bloodshed grew so serious that the Muslims began keeping their weapons next to their beds at night. And the Prophet ﷺ was also protected by armed bodyguards until Allah SWT revealed the verse, Surah 5, Ayat 67, Surah Al-Ma'idah, Allah will guard you from mankind. So next, the permission to fight is given. So up to this point, the Prophet ﷺ had counseled Muslims to endure the insults and the abuses in silence. Now, however, the Muslims had the upper hand. This newfound supremacy triggered off even fiercer opposition from their enemies. And at last, Allah made it permissible for Muslims to fight against the oppressors, and this permission later became a duty. And the permission to fight was given in stages. At first, the Muslims were allowed to fight only the Quraysh because they were the first to oppress Muslims in Mecca. And Muslims were allowed to seize their goods, but not those of tribes at peace with them. Then the Muslims were allowed to fight any pagan tribe that allied itself with the Quraysh or any other pagan tribe that oppressed Muslims. And later, the Muslims were permitted to fight any Jewish tribe that broke its covenant with the Muslims. In such a case, the covenant was automatically nullified. And subsequently, the Muslims were allowed to fight people of the book, i.e. the Christians or Jews who harassed or persecuted them. And if the people of the book surrendered to the Islamic State and paid the jizya, the nominal tax for non-Muslims, then the Muslims were forbidden to fight them. And finally, the Muslims were required to make peace with any polytheists, Jews or Christians who embraced Islam, and to respect their rights and property. So in the military expeditions of Saraya and Ghazawat, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So now that Allah had enjoined Muslims to fight in self-defense, the Prophet ﷺ molded the formerly oppressed meek community into a military organization that would fight to survive. It would no longer tolerate the depredations of every tribe that decided to prey on them. And archery and horsemanship were held out as activities to excel in, and the Prophet ﷺ organized the Muslims into cavalry units called Saraya, and sometimes he would accompany these squadrons, and the expeditions he took part in were called Ghazawat. And the cavalry units undertook four main tasks. Primarily, they were to protect the outskirts of Medina and to gather intelligence about any sort of suspicious activities. Secondly, they worked to intercept the Meccan trade caravans passing through the areas. Many Muslims have been forced to leave their wealth behind in Mecca when they migrated to Medina. Therefore, Muslims were allowed to retaliate by raiding caravans financed by the Quraysh. And thirdly, it was the responsibility of these cavalry units to make covenants with other tribes outside Medina. And the Prophet ﷺ saw that the need to develop good relationships with these tribes so that they would not ally themselves with the Quraysh. And lastly, the units were entrusted with the task of spreading the message of Islam throughout Arabia. The first Sariya, the singular form of Saraya, that the Prophet ﷺ dispatched was called Sariya Saif al-Bahr, It took place in Ramadan, the first year of the Hijrah, the first year of the Prophet ﷺ's migration, or the Hijrah. AH refers to after the Hijrah. The Prophet ﷺ's uncle Hamza bin Abdullah Muttalib led the squadron accompanied by 30 Muhajirin, and they headed for the coast of the Red Sea on the outskirts of Ais and came across a caravan headed by Abu Jahl that was returning from Syria. And a battle almost erupted when the two parties faced each other, but Majdi bin Amr Jahni intervened and matters subsided. This was the first Sharia in the history of Islam, and the Muslims rode beneath a white standard, the first ever used by Muslims, borne by Abu Marthad bin Hassin Ghanwi. And in the following months, the Prophet ﷺ sent a number of Saraya, one after another. Abu Ubaid bin Harith led a party of 60 Muhajirin to Batin Rabi, and they came across Abu Sufyan and 200 Meccans. Arrows were shot from both sides, but there was no combat, and Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas was dispatched along with 20 Muhajirin to Rabi' near Harar, but the men returned without having had to fight. Then in Safar, the second after the year Hijrah, for the first time, the Prophet ﷺ himself went out to battle accompanied by 70 Muhajirin. They journeyed to Abwa or Wadan, but once again, they did not come across any enemies. However, it was during this journey that the Prophet ﷺ finalized a treaty of peace and cooperation with Amr bin Makhshi of al-Dhormi. And the following month, Rabi al-Awwal, second of Hijrah, after the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ led a group of men to Huwat on the outskirts of Radawi. And during the same month, Khurz bin Jabir al-Fihri rustled some grazing cattle belonging to the Muslims. And the Prophet ﷺ gathered 70 Muhajirin and chased them to Safwan on the outskirts of Badr, but Khurz escaped. But this expedition is known as the first Battle of Badr. So the Prophet ﷺ also led a squadron of 150 to 200 Muhajirin in either Jamad al-Awwal or Jamad al-Thani, the second of after the Hijrah, and they went to Dhur Ashira to intercept a caravan headed for Syria, but it had passed a few days before they had arrived. And during this journey, the Prophet ﷺ finalized a non-aggression pact with Banu Mudlaj. And to further steel his men in the art of warfare, the Prophet ﷺ sent Abdullah bin Jashish Asadi along with 12 Muhajirin to Nakhla, an area between Mecca and Taif, in Rajab, second of after the Hijrah. And their objective was to gather intelligence about a caravan financed by the Quraysh, and Abdullah's men attacked the caravan and killed one person. And they also took 2 captives whom they brought back to Medina. And when the Prophet ﷺ heard what had happened, he became very upset, and he set the prisoners free and paid blood money to the victim's family. And the Quraysh protested vehemently about the attacks because it took place in Rajab, one of the prohibited months, in the period during which fighting is unlawful. And Allah SWT revealed the following verses in reference to the Muslims' attack on the caravan. Surah Al-Baqarah, Surah 2, Ayat 2:17. Allah SWT says in the English translation, they ask you concerning fighting in the prohibited months. Say, fighting during these months is a grave offense, but preventing people from following the path of Allah, disbelieving in Him, and preventing access to the sacred mosque and driving out its residents are greater offenses with Allah. Unrest and oppression are worse than killing. And next, the new Qibla. In Shaban, the second year after the Hijrah, the Qibla, the direction in which Muslims pray towards, was changed from Beit al-Maqdis in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, to the Kaaba in Mecca. And the change was announced by Allah in a verse in the Quran, and the Prophet ﷺ and the sincere Muslims rejoiced over this change. And the hypocrites who had pretended to be Muslims, however, protested the change, and many of them reverted to either Judaism or paganism, thereby purifying the ranks of Muslims. And with that, I think this next section, it's a couple of pages long here. Let's stop here, and we'll continue next week, inshallah, to dissect into regarding the history of the Battle of Badr. with next week's reading, inshallah. Jazakallah khairan, everybody, for joining in. If you have any questions or would like to join us, please feel free to join us for the live reading and the discussion afterwards. And with that, we'll close out of the live stream. Allahumma subhanaka wa bihamdi ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.